The Old Testament is often a problem for Christians. In fact, it's been a problem for about 2 millennia. At the beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era, or AD if you prefer, there was a fellow named Marcion. He identified himself as a Christian, but he came to the conclusion that the God of the Old Testament could not possibly be the same as the God of the New Testament. Marcion concluded that the God of Genesis was a weak and inept, foolish God who couldn't even find Adam and Eve in the garden. This God sought to keep Adam and Eve from obtaining knowledge. This God was so wrathful that he destroyed the entire world in a flood. This was a God who ruled by law rather than by love. Obviously, this couldn't be the same as Jesus' God, the God of love and compassion and mercy. And obviously, therefore, according to Marcion, the Old Testament, the Bible of the synagogue, could not possibly be the Bible of the church. It couldn't be sacred scripture. Well, because Marcion couldn't accept the Old Testament as sacred scripture, and because he had a church and he needed some sort of text, he decided to create his own. And what he wound up doing was putting together what was apparently the first collection of New Testament documents. He developed his own list of inspired scriptures. He took some of Paul's letters and he took the Gospel of Luke. But from that gospel, he stripped out any possible reference, any possible allusion to Old Testament material. So we had Luke, but out went the nativity stories, out went Jesus' baptism, gone was the genealogy, out went all of those fulfillment quotations from the Old Testament, gone was the parable of the fig tree, gone was the parable of the prodigal son, out went Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, gone was the cleansing of the temple. And anyone who has ever had any positive thoughts about these marvelous sections of the Gospel of Luke would run into trouble with Marcion. Marcion would say that's Old Testament material, it's not sacred scripture. By the year 144 or thereabouts, Marcion had his own church and it was growing by leaps and bounds. The rest of Christianity, the rest of the church, concluded fairly quickly that Marcion's gospel was an incorrect gospel, that Marcion's reading of the Old Testament was an incorrect reading, and they declared him a heretic. But here's the problem. Marcion may have been declared a heretic, but Marcion's legacy lives on because there are Marcionites in the church today.
There's a very wonderful book by the New Testament scholar Niels Dahl called Jesus in the Memory of the Early Church. One of the things that Dahl says in that book, which is a very important thing always to remember as we try to think about what we can really know about Jesus as he actually lived in history, is this, and I quote him: "We do not escape the fact that we know Jesus only as the disciples remembered him. Whoever thinks that the disciples completely misunderstood their master or even consciously falsified his picture may give fantasy free rein." Sadly, as one picks up every Christmas and Easter the latest breathless revelations about the truth about Jesus can really be told, as we read these stories about how there was all some vast conspiracy to cover up the truth about Jesus, what we're seeing is what Dahl prophesied, that people are simply giving fantasy free rein. The only Jesus we know from the sources is the Jesus who passionately understood his own vocation to be Israel's Messiah, and who was crucified, dead, and buried, and raised on the third day for the redemption of the world.
On the third day, he rose again in accordance with the Scriptures. That's what Christians, in my tradition at least, say again and again in their regular worship when they repeat one of the great Christian creeds. But many of them are then a little puzzled. What do we actually mean? What do we really believe happened to Jesus 3 days after he was crucified? And that's something that has been very controversial over the last many generations, and I and others have struggled to try to make it clear, and that's what I'm going to try and do now. Let's get clear to begin with about what the idea of resurrection itself is all about. In our culture, often people think of resurrection simply as a nice way of saying going to heaven when you die. So-and-so has died and been raised from the dead. I heard it in a funeral the other day. As Jesus has been raised to heaven, so we believe that our late departed brother has been raised to heaven. But that's not what resurrection itself is actually all about. Resurrection always was a word which meant a new sort of bodily life sometime after being bodily dead. Now that's an odd one because, of course, in the ancient world, almost nobody believed that such a thing was possible. People sometimes imagine today that with the rise of modern science, we know that dead people don't rise. But actually, we didn't need 18th or 19th or 20th or 21st century science to tell us that dead people don't rise. It's been obvious since the very beginning. You find the ancient Greek poets like Homer and Aeschylus saying it quite clearly. Resurrection? No, of course that doesn't happen. They have all sorts of other theories about where people might go, where souls might go, either down into the depths of the earth, into Hades, or off into some blissful future. But no, not resurrection. They say that couldn't happen. And it was so at the time of Jesus and at the time of Paul, the great philosophers and teachers of the early Roman Empire. Whenever anyone mentions to them the possibility that somebody might be bodily raised from the dead, they say, don't be ridiculous, nice idea, but it doesn't happen. They had myths about it, ways of talking about the fact that you could think about it, but it didn't happen, like Orpheus going down into the underworld to get his beloved wife Eurydice back again. The deal is that he's allowed to go down and bring her back, but he has to walk up looking away from her, and if he looks back, she'll be gone. And of course, halfway up the long passage from Hades, what we find is that his desire for her overcomes him, and he does look back, and then she's gone indeed. And that's a way of saying, yeah, we can imagine what resurrection might be like, but in fact, we know it's not going to happen, so forget it. All except for one major strand of thinking in the ancient world, which is the thinking we find among the Jewish people.